Under the shadow of Rome's colossal arches where marble statues gleamed and golden palaces dazzled the eyes of visitors, the empire projected an image of unmatched glory. Senators boasted of law and order, poets sang of civilization's triumph, and emperors paraded their families as symbols of stability. From a distance it all looked invincible, a civilization that claimed to have mastered not only armies and seas, but even the very idea of human destiny. Yet behind those walls of triumph another truth whispered. It was not written in inscriptions of victory or carved into the triumphal columns. It was etched instead in silence, in tears shed by women whose stories were never meant to be told. Imagine a bride scarcely more than a child, her white gown clinging awkwardly to her thin frame. Her face is streaked with tears, though the crowd around her cheers as though this is a day of joy. In the grand atriums of Rome where torches flared and musicians played, her cries were not a scandal, they were expected, even celebrated. The empire called this a wedding. To her, it was the moment her childhood was stripped away forever. We grow up with Rome's image as the cradle of law, philosophy, and order. But what textbooks rarely whisper is that its grandeur rested on private cruelties. The Roman wedding was not a story of love, devotion, or shared futures. It was a performance, a contract, a cold transaction between families seeking advantage. The bride's silence was demanded. Her obedience guaranteed her future already sealed long before the ceremony began. Even the most gilded queens, crowned with laurel and robed in gold, trembled on their wedding nights. They knew they were not entering a partnership but stepping into a prison. Every ritual was staged to remind her of this truth. The splendor that glittered to the guests, the flowers, the veils, the feasts, was a mask, hiding a darker purpose. These ceremonies were not about celebration. They were about control. Rome perfected the art of turning personal lives into public theatre, and nowhere was this more brutal than in the marriages of its elite women. Behind the polished image of marble halls and victorious emperors lay a civilization where women lived in fear, their bodies and destinies treated as instruments of policy. Rome's beauty was not only its art and architectures, but also its deception. For beneath the facade of progress was a reality that resembles not a fairy tale, but a nightmare, one that was ritualized, legalized, and celebrated by all. By the end of this story, we will peel away the mask of Rome's glory to reveal what its brides truly endured. You will see that the empire's magnificence was built not only on conquest and law, but also on silence and suffering. And once seen, this truth is impossible to forget. Before we continue, leave a like and subscribe, only if it truly feels natural. And now softly tell me, where are you listening from? In Rome, a girl's life was not her own, not even from the moment she learned to speak. To be born into an elite family was to enter a marketplace disguised as a household where your worth was measured not in affection, but in political leverage. Before her hair had ever been braided, before she could recite her lessons, her destiny was already signed away. Fathers, patres familias with near absolute legal power, could pledge their daughters as infants. These contracts, called sponsalia, were not symbolic promises, but binding agreements that tied a child's future body to the ambitions of men she had never met. Roman law had no patience for innocence. Consent was irrelevant, even inappropriate. A girl did not marry, she was assigned. A father could look upon his toddler in the nursery, and with a single agreement seal her fate as the wife of a man twice or three times her age. The sponsalia was conducted before witnesses with formal words and gestures as serious in tone as any treaty between nations. The girl's hand might still be soft from play, but legally, she was no longer free, her childhood transformed into collateral for her family's political survival. This system was not unique to Rome, though the Romans codified it with ruthless efficiency. Across antiquity, dynasties sacrificed daughters to secure peace or forge alliances. Egyptian pharaohs sent royal brides to foreign kings. Macedonian generals traded daughters like gifts of conquest. In medieval Europe, betrothals at birth would echo this Roman precedent. What distinguished Rome, however, was how deeply the practice was embedded into its legal structure. Under the doctrine of patria potestas, the father's authority over his children was so absolute that he could sell them, disown them, or arrange their marriages without question. His word was law, and the law agreed with him. Imagine the psychological burden for a girl growing up under this shadow. She would play with dolls, weave cloth, and listen to stories of gods and heroes, all while knowing that her future had already been sold. Some were promised away before they could even walk steadily. By the time they could read, they belonged to another household in name, if not yet in presence. Even when a betrothal was broken, the girl herself had no say. It was her father who renegotiated transferring her like property in a new exchange. The Romans cloaked this system in the language of honour and duty. The girl was told she was serving her family, that her marriage would protect Rome, that she was a living link between noble houses. Yet beneath the lofty phrases was a transaction that stripped her of humanity. She was not a daughter to be cherished, but an asset to be deployed. If her value declined, if alliances shifted, if her fertility was doubted, she could be cast aside, her betrothal annulled, and her body reassigned like a parcel of land. The cold arithmetic of Roman politics is startling when viewed without its marble veneer. To a father in Rome, his daughter was less a child than a ledger entry. She represented dowry inheritance bloodline. She was a coin stamped not with Caesar's face, but with her family's crest circulating through the empire's marriage markets, and like any coin, she could be traded, hoarded, or discarded at will. The Roman elite treated marriage less as a sacred bond than as a public auction block. Behind the gilded doors of patrician villas, daughters were not introduced as children, with hopes and talents, but displayed as commodities whose value could be measured in dowries, lineage, and political advantage. The practice was so normalized that to speak against it would have seemed absurd. Families prided themselves on the good marriages they arranged, which usually meant that they had sold their daughters to the highest bidder in Rome's unending competition for power. The bargaining began with dowry negotiations. A dowry was not a gift, it was a guarantee, a pledge of wealth that made the bride attractive to powerful suitors. Land estates, even entire villas, might be packaged alongside her. To marry a daughter without a substantial dowry was to lower her value. To add property and gold to her name was to raise her price. Fathers often bankrupted themselves to provide competitive dowries, treating the exchange as a financial investment rather than an act of paternal care. For the men receiving these brides, the dowry was a form of collateral, a safety net to ensure loyalty and obedience. The most notorious example was Augustus himself, the emperor who reshaped Rome into an empire. His hunger for control extended even into the bedrooms of his household. When he desired Livia, Drusilla already married and pregnant with another man's child, Augustus forced her to divorce her husband and marry him. Within days she became the emperor's wife, and within months she bore a child who belonged to her former husband, while standing under Augustus's roof. Livia's will was irrelevant, her body a vessel redirected by imperial decree. The marriage was celebrated as a triumph of destiny, but in truth it was nothing more than an act of political abduction disguised as matrimony. Nor was Augustus unique. Dynasties across the world practiced similar cruelties. In Egypt, Ptolemaic queens were wed to their brothers, their bodies bound to keep bloodlines pure. In medieval Europe, daughters of kings were dispatched at 13 or 14 to foreign courts, pawns in treaties they could barely comprehend. Yet Rome's system carried a special brutality because of its frequency and its scale. With dozens of senatorial families competing for favour, daughters were shuffled like counters on a board, each alliance lasting only until a stronger opportunity presented itself. A marriage could be annulled overnight, not because of love lost, but because new political winds demanded a fresh exchange. Historians describe these transactions in dry terms: alliances, unions, betrothals, but strip away the euphemisms and what remains is a trade in flesh. A girl might be praised for her beauty, her modesty, her supposed virtue, but these were marketing tools no different than advertising the fertility of cattle or the productivity of vineyards. Her body carried the promise of heirs, her dowry promised wealth, her name promised prestige. When the hammer fell, she was delivered into another household not as a partner, but as proof of a bargain well struck. For the men, the arrangement brought wealth, property, and proximity to power. For the women, it brought silence. They could not protest, for protest would dishonour their families. They could not refuse, for refusal was legally impossible. And they could not escape, for even divorce returned them to the same cycle to be bartered again like damaged goods. Rome's grandeur was built not only on the blood of soldiers and the tribute of conquered lands, but also on these private auctions held in the dining rooms and courtyards of its noblest houses. Every treaty, every alliance, every shift in political fortune had a woman's name at its foundation, written not as a heroine, but as a ledger entry, a transaction sealed with her silence. From the very beginning, Roman girls were conditioned to accept a life that was never truly their own. Before they even understood what marriage meant, their world was shaped to prepare them for it. A boy might be taught oratory law and rhetoric skills that would one day give him a voice in the Senate. A girl, by contrast, was taught silence. She learned to weave, to spin wool, to oversee household slaves. She memorized hymns to the gods and the rituals of the hearth, absorbing the lesson that her role was to serve, to nurture, and above all to obey. The very language of Roman culture reinforced this division. The ideal woman was praised not for her accomplishments, but for her pudicitia, her chastity, modesty, and capacity to endure. In funerary inscriptions, women were celebrated with the same formulaic words. She stayed at home, she spun wool. The epitaph was not a reflection of personality, but of compliance, proof that she had conformed to the narrow mould expected of her. Even in death, a woman's virtue was measured by how well she had disappeared into her duties. Stories told in the home and marketplace drove these lessons even deeper. Every child in Rome knew the story of Lucretia, the noblewoman whose rape by a prince and subsequent suicide sparked the overthrow of the monarchy. But the lesson for girls was not rebellion. It was that a woman's honour was more important than her life. A violated woman was expected to die rather than speak because her voice could be seen as more shameful than the crime itself. Similarly, the myth of the Sabine women abducted by Rome's first men to provide wives was remembered not for their suffering but for their eventual acceptance. They were praised for stopping the war between their fathers and their abductors, embodying the Roman ideal women who endured violence and transformed it into service for the state. These cultural myths were not neutral stories, they were weapons of conditioning. A girl raised on Lucretia and the Sabine women learned that her body was not her own, that her silence was honourable, and that her sacrifice was expected. When the time came for her to be handed to a husband, she had already rehearsed the role for years. Even the physical spaces of childhood reinforced her fate. The Roman home was divided into public and private spheres, but girls rarely crossed into the public one. They were kept near the hearth, learning the duties of the matron from their mothers and nurses. Their movements were restricted, their voices seldom heard beyond the family walls. To speak boldly was dangerous, to laugh too loudly was indecent to look. A man in the eye could be interpreted as immodesty. Every gesture of daily life was a rehearsal for the marriage contract that awaited. And so when her wedding day arrived, the Roman bride was not merely being forced into a new role, she was stepping into a part she had been trained to play since birth. Her silence at the altar was not surprising. It was the culmination of a lifetime of practice. She had been told again and again in stories and rituals in the very architecture of her home that her voice was dangerous, her body was not hers, and her destiny was to serve the ambitions of men. The Roman wedding day was staged as a spectacle, but for the bride it was a carefully choreographed humiliation. From the moment she was dressed, every detail of her attire spoke not of celebration, but of submission. She wore a simple white tunic tied with the so-called knot of Hercules, a knot so intricate that only her husband was permitted to untie it, and only in the privacy of their wedding night. To the guests it was a charming symbol of fertility. To the bride it was a public advertisement of what was expected, that her body, her virginity, and her future belonged to the man waiting to claim her. Over her head was draped the flammeum, a veil dyed in blazing shades of orange and red. Roman writers described the colour as resembling both fire and blood, symbols of destruction as much as creation. It transformed the girl into the image of a sacrificial victim, her identity swallowed beneath the fabric. To look at a Roman bride was to look upon someone being led not to a feast but to an altar of surrender. Her hair too was twisted into 6 braids styled in imitation of the Vestal virgins. Yet the irony was cruel. The Vestals were sworn to chastity and held power through their sacred vow, while the bride was stripped of autonomy and offered as property. Around her the air pulsed with the sounds of ritual. Flutes played shrill melodies, attendants shouted invocations to the gods, torches blazed their smoke mixing with the scent of flowers scattered on the ground. The procession moved through streets filled with chants and laughter, but the bride's face remained downcast. Roman law and custom required her to appear reluctant to embody the fiction that she was being seized against her will. The spectacle of noise and colour was not for her, it was for the witnesses who would later swear that the marriage had been properly enacted. The guests laughed, feasted, and sang hymns of joy, yet beneath the merriment lay a darker purpose. The music and clamour created a wall of sound around the bride, drowning out her tears, turning her silence into just another instrument of the ceremony. Even the children who ran ahead of the procession, tossing nuts into the street, were reenacting a cruel metaphor. The nuts symbolised discarded childhood, scattered and gone, never to return. When she reached the doorway of her new husband's house, the rituals pressed the lesson even deeper. She was smeared with oil and wrapped in garlands, symbols of transition, but also of ownership. Every gesture, every chant, every flicker of fire reminded her that she was passing from one man's authority to another's. The ceremony, with its music, perfumes, and feasts, was not a celebration of union, but a theatre of domination. In this theatre, the bride played the central role, but she was not the author of the script. She was the sacrifice dressed in finery, the offering wrapped in flame-coloured cloth. Her humiliation was not a side effect of the wedding, it was the very purpose. The empire called it tradition, but to the women who endured it, it was the first step into a lifetime of silence. If you enjoyed this moment, leave a comment with the number 1 below, so I know you're still here with me. The Roman bride on her wedding day was not celebrated as a partner, but prepared as if for ritual slaughter. Her very appearance was sculpted to echo Rome's oldest religious ceremonies. The 6 braids that crowned her head were not merely decorative, they mirrored the hairstyle of the Vestal virgins, the women charged with guarding the sacred flame of Vesta. But where the Vestals derived spiritual authority from chastity and independence, the bride's imitation was hollow. She was not being consecrated for divine service, she was being consecrated for a man's household. The irony was cruel, for her resemblance to the Vestals suggested purity, yet unlike them, she was destined for submission. The veil of flame orange that covered her face reinforced the illusion. To Roman eyes, its colour carried powerful associations: fire, sacrifice, transformation. Brides were compared openly to victims offered on the altar, their veils recalling both the smoke of burning offerings and the blood spilled in sacred ritual. Ancient writers themselves drew the connection. Just as a lamb or bull was adorned with garlands before being led to sacrifice, so too was the bride crowned with flowers, perfumed and veiled in colour, meant to remind all present that her old life was ending. This was no accident of symbolism. Roman religion and Roman marriage were fused into one system of control. To marry was not only to join a household, but to participate in what the state recognized as a sacred transfer of authority. The ceremony was punctuated with invocations to deities: Juno, goddess of marriage; Janus of doorways; even the Lars, the household gods. Yet beneath these prayers lay a darker truth. The gods were invoked not to protect the bride, but to sanctify her surrender. Consider the imagery from Rome's sacrifices. Before a bull was slain, its horns were gilded, its body decorated with ribbons, its path marked by music and chanting. The animal was made beautiful before its death, its dignity masked by ornament. The same was true of the bride. Her veil, her garlands, her jewellery were not gifts to honour her person. They were disguises meant to mask the loss of self that was about to occur. She was dressed not for celebration, but for obliteration, her childhood extinguished in the name of duty. And the public understood this. To see a bride in her fiery veil was to be reminded of Rome's deepest cultural logic, that women's bodies were offerings to the stability of the state. Their fertility was Rome's future, their obedience Rome's order. The rituals did not disguise the brutality, they sanctified it. To resist would be to resist not just a husband, but the gods themselves. Thus the Roman wedding was less a union of 2 lives than a liturgy of power. Every braid, every veil, every flower spoke the language of sacrifice. The bride's silence was not incidental, it was essential, the final mark that she had accepted her role as victim. Rome's religion gave the empire grandeur, but it also gave cruelty the aura of holiness, and for countless women marriage was the altar on which they were sacrificed. Roman law demanded that the bride appear unwilling. On her wedding day, tears were not only expected, they were required. To cry, to scream, to resist, was to play her part in the theatre of submission. If she looked too eager, the marriage could be declared invalid, for Roman society insisted on the fiction that every bride was being abducted. Consent was not only unnecessary, it was dangerous. A willing bride risked undermining the entire legal foundation of the union. So the spectacle began. As the procession wound its way through the streets, the bride clung to her mother, weeping, while attendants pulled her arms away. Neighbours gathered not to intervene but to cheer. The louder her cries, the better the omen. For onlookers, her pain was a sign that the marriage was being enacted properly, that the ancient customs were being honoured. The mother too was expected to resist, clutching her daughter's hand as if unwilling to let go. But this struggle was ritualised, carefully controlled, a performance in which both knew the ending was inevitable. Imagine the scene in vivid detail, the orange veil trembling with each sob, the girl's bare feet dragged across the threshold of her new household, while flute players filled the air with shrill triumphant notes. Children tossed nuts into the street, a mocking celebration of her lost childhood. The bride's cries rose above the music echoing through the atrium as her relatives looked on. To them, this was not cruelty, it was tradition. To the girl, it was terror, sanctified by law. This ritual abduction echoed Rome's own origin myth, the rape of the Sabine women. According to a legend, when Rome was a fledgling settlement without wives for its men, Romulus invited neighbouring tribes to a festival. At a signal, Roman men seized the Sabine women and carried them off by force. The story was later told as a moment of destiny, the women praised for accepting their fate and even mediating peace between their fathers and abductors. But the myth did more than explain Rome's beginnings. It normalized the idea that the taking of women by force, by tears, by ritual, was the foundation of Roman civilization. Every wedding reenacted this legacy, transforming a girl's cries into echoes of that first violent abduction. The cruelty lay not just in the act itself, but in the crowd's complicity. Families, priests and neighbours all participated, ensuring that no bride could hope for rescue. Her tears were converted into ritual, her screams into legal proof. What looked like resistance was in fact submission, carefully orchestrated so that everyone could pretend she had been taken rather than given. In this theatre of tears, the bride was the centrepiece of a drama older than herself, a play she was compelled to perform so that Rome could assure itself that its tradition still lived. And when the door closed behind her, the audience dispersed. The spectacle was over. The girl was no longer a daughter, no longer a child. She was now a possession, her cries silenced by the stone walls of a stranger's home. The final act of the Roman wedding ceremony was as symbolic as it was chilling. When the bride arrived at her husband's home, she was not permitted to walk inside of her own will. Instead, she was lifted and carried across the threshold. Today, popular culture romanticizes this gesture as a token of affection, a playful sign of new beginnings. In Rome, it meant something far darker. The bride was forbidden to step into her new household by her own power. She entered as cargo delivered from one man's possession into another's. The threshold itself was sacred space. Roman houses were designed with the atrium at the centre, where the hearth and the household gods, the Lars and Penates, were honoured. To cross the threshold was to be admitted into a new world, one ruled absolutely by the husband. For the bride, being carried inside was not a mark of tenderness but of erasure. She could not enter on her own terms because she had no terms. Her identity dissolved at the door, and with it the last traces of her autonomy. The symbolism was layered and brutal. In Roman religion, thresholds were liminal zones guarded by the god Janus, who presided over beginnings and transitions. Passing through meant transformation. The bride's passage was no exception. Once inside, she no longer belonged to her father's house, but to her husband's patria potestas. The same law that once gave her father the right to arrange her marriage, to disown or even to execute her, now gave those rights to her husband. The threshold was the moment this transfer was enacted, not with contracts or speeches, but with her silent body hoisted in another's arms. The scene must have been unforgettable. The girl veiled in orange flame, her braids tight like those of a priestess. Her face streaked with tears, lifted as if she were a burden to be carried rather than a partner to be welcomed. Guests would cheer, offering blessings and crude jokes. Priests muttered prayers as torches smoked by the doorway. And then, with the slam of a heavy wooden door, she was enclosed. No longer a daughter under her father's roof, she was now a wife under her husband's dominion. Roman domestic architecture itself reinforced her captivity. The atrium where she would be paraded to pay homage to the household gods symbolized the hearth she was now bound to serve. Beyond it lay the women's quarters, where she would weave supervised slaves and rear children, spaces designed for silence hidden from public view. The door she had crossed so dramatically was more than an entrance. It was a barrier, one she could not pass again without her husband's permission. What to the Romans seemed a joyful rite was in truth a ritual of disappearance. At the threshold, a girl vanished into a woman defined not by her desires, but by her function. She was a vessel for heirs, a keeper of the hearth, a silent shadow within the walls of a house she would never truly call her own. The doorway was not a welcome, it was a gate, and once she crossed it, she belonged to Rome's oldest prison marriage. In the Roman world, marriage was not a union of two hearts, it was a transaction of ownership. At its core stood the legal structure known as manus, meaning hand. The word itself told the story the bride passed from the hand of her father into the hand of her husband. She was not a citizen with rights of her own, but a possession transferred between men. Under the doctrine of patria potestas, the father's power, every Roman daughter lived under the absolute authority of her paterfamilias. He could arrange her marriage, annul it, or even end her life, all with the law's blessing. But once a daughter married Manu with the hand that power shifted seamlessly to her husband, she ceased to be part of her father's family altogether entering. Instead, her husband's household as if she had been adopted by him. Her dowry, her property, even her legal identity followed the same path. She became in every sense absorbed into his dominion. The parallels with slavery were impossible to ignore. Roman jurists often used identical language when describing a man's authority over his wife and over his slaves. In both cases, the master or husband could command obedience, administer punishment, and dispose of property as he saw fit. A wife had no independent capacity to make contracts, own land, or represent herself in court. If she wished to act, she needed her husband's consent, just as a slave needed his master's. One surviving legal text preserved in Justinian's Digest explains bluntly that a wife in manus was in the power of her husband in the manner of a daughter. This comparison was not a metaphor. The law literally erased her previous family ties and reclassified her as a dependent of her husband, with fewer protections than livestock or estates. Philander could not complain, but a woman might, so the law silenced her before she could speak. Yet manus marriage was not the only form. Over time, some elite families preferred union sine manu, without the hand, in which the bride remained legally under her father's authority, even while living with her husband. To modernize, this seems like a reprieve, but in practice it was another trap. Such arrangements were often motivated by financial calculation. A father could retain control over his daughter's dowry and property, while the husband exercised control over her body and daily life. Either way, the woman herself had no freedom. Her fate was a tug-of-war between two patriarchs, each holding her like a piece of contested land. To step back is to see how deeply Rome enshrined this inequality. Citizenship, that proud Roman invention, was never meant for women. They were instruments of lineage, conduits, of inheritance shadows moving from one household ledger to another. Even in inscriptions, women were listed in relation to men, daughter of, wife of, mother of. Their individuality disappeared into legal formulas, their personhood smothered by the cold hand of law. Thus, when a Roman bride spoke her vows, she was not pledging love or fidelity. She was acknowledging transfer of title, like a farm or a villa changing owners. Rome called it marriage. In truth, it was ownership dressed in ritual enslavement sanctified by tradition. In Rome, a wife's life was not her own. The moment vows were spoken, her existence fell into the hands of her husband with a completeness that shocks modern eyes. Under the law, he could strike her, confine her, force himself upon her, seize her possessions, and if he deemed it necessary, end her life. This was not hidden brutality. It was enshrined as a husband's right, even his duty to maintain order in the household. Marriage was framed as a transfer of guardianship, but in practice it was absolute domination. Roman jurists compared the husband's power to that of a magistrate with the wife as his subject. Domestic violence was not a crime, it was governance. A man who failed to discipline his wife could even be mocked by his peers as if indulgence were weakness. And should he kill her? The law asked only that he provide justification. Adultery, disobedience, drunkenness, excuses that required no proof beyond his word. The cultural climate reinforced this cruelty. Cato the Elder, celebrated as a model of Roman virtue, once declared, "If you catch your wife drinking wine, you may kill her without trial. If she commits adultery, you may kill her with your own hands." To Cato, the wife was less a companion than a liability, her behaviour a potential stain on the family's honour. His words were not rhetorical flourish, they reflected the accepted reality that a husband's authority extended over life and death. To modern ears, such declarations sound barbaric, but Rome was hardly alone. Patriarchal systems across history echoed the same logic. In ancient Athens, wives could be discarded for the faintest suspicion of infidelity. In medieval Europe, a husband's right of correction permitted him to beat his wife so long as he did not kill her. Even in the early modern world, English common law enshrined the doctrine of coverture, in which a wife's legal identity vanished into her husband's. Rome may seem distant, but its shadows stretch across centuries, reminding us how deeply rooted this system of control has been. What made the Roman version uniquely terrifying was its clarity. There was no hypocrisy, no pretense of equality. A wife's body, wealth and honour were extensions of her husband's power. He could sell her dowry, strip her of possessions, deny her food or freedom, and the law stood firmly by his side. If she resisted, she was not a victim, but a rebel against household order, a rebel who could be punished as harshly as any criminal. And yet Roman society praised this arrangement as the foundation of stability. Philosophers extolled the obedient wife as a mirror of the obedient citizen. Poets celebrated female silence as a virtue more precious than beauty. The cruelty was not hidden, it was elevated to an ideal. A Roman wife might sit at the feast beside her husband, her hair braided in intricate styles, her jewelry gleaming, but behind the facade she knew her survival depended entirely on his whim. Her life was quite literally in his hands. For a Roman wife trapped in the grip of her husband's authority, escape was less a door than a mirage. Technically, divorce was possible. Rome, unlike many ancient societies, did not forbid the dissolution of marriage. But what the law allowed, society punished. A divorced woman was branded with disgrace. Her reputation shattered, her usefulness to her family diminished. She often returned to her father's house in humiliation, bringing with her the stigma of failure. For elites, the shame was doubled. Divorce could weaken political alliances, making her a liability rather than an asset. Few fathers welcomed such burdensome daughters back, nor was divorce always her choice. Husbands could dismiss their wives at will sometimes, by nothing more than sending her belongings back to her father's home. A woman cast out this way often found herself adrift, her dowry stripped, her status in ruins. For many it was the beginning of social death. And yet some women found that life outside the bonds of respectable marriage offered a paradoxical freedom. Courtesans, concubines, and mistresses lived on the margins of Roman society, scorned in public, yet sometimes wielding real power in private. Freed from the rigid obligations of marriage, they could own property, conduct business, and choose their lovers. Their position was precarious, dependent on wealth and favour, but it allowed a kind of autonomy unimaginable for most wives. The stories of famous courtesans illuminate this strange contradiction. Take Volumnia Cytheris, a freedwoman and actress who became mistress to Marcus Antonius himself. Though derided by senators for her low birth and profession, she travelled with Antony on campaigns, was showered with gifts, and moved in circles far above her station. Her life was dangerous, her reputation constantly under attack, but she lived on her own terms, something many noble wives could only dream of. Even concubinage, though still an unequal arrangement, offered certain advantages. A concubine was not bound by manus. Her body and identity were not legally absorbed into a man's household. If the relationship ended, she was not marked by divorce or returned in disgrace. For some women, especially freed women, and those of lower status, concubinage was a calculated choice, less prestigious than marriage, but freer in practice. Elite wives trapped by the golden chains of dynastic politics sometimes looked on these marginal figures with envy. Within the walls of palaces and villas, queens and noblewomen endured surveillance, silence, and constant pressure to bear heirs. Meanwhile, women outside the system, though mocked, insulted, and excluded from respectability, could sometimes maneuver with greater agency. These were not true escapes. Courtesans risked violence and slander. Concubines remained vulnerable to a man's whims. But their lives exposed the cracks in Rome's patriarchal order. They proved that within a society that demanded silence from wives, some women could carve spaces of independence, however fragile, by stepping outside the boundaries of respectability. For the majority of Roman women, however, such paths were illusions. They remained locked in marriages, where disgrace was the only alternative, where every road led back to submission. Their choices were not between freedom and captivity, but between different forms of survival. When the doors closed and the last echoes of celebration faded, the Roman bride faced the most terrifying ritual of all, the wedding night. What the guests outside called a union of two houses, the husband inside treated as a conquest. Roman writers themselves left little doubt. Ovid in his Ars Amatoria described seduction and marriage in the language of campaign siege, victory, surrender. Martial joked crudely of husbands storming the citadel of their wives. The metaphors were not accidental. They revealed a worldview in which intimacy was war, and the bride's body was territory to be subdued. Most of these brides were scarcely more than children, 12, 13, 15. At most married to men twice their age, sometimes older. On the streets the procession had framed her as a sacrifice. Now within the lamp-lit silence of her husband's house, she became the spoils of battle. Torches flickered in the atrium, their smoke curling upward as servants withdrew, leaving behind an atmosphere heavy with expectation. Outside guests still sang bawdy hymns to him and the god of marriage, their drunken chants urging consummation. Inside the girl sat frozen, her flame-coloured veil, now a shroud she could not remove. To the Romans, her fear was not a problem to solve, but a feature of the ritual. Silence was praised, resistance expected. A bride's trembling was proof of her modesty, her terror the sign of her virtue. If she had walked into her new role calmly, she would have been condemned as shameless. The ideal bride was voiceless, pliant, conquered in spirit before her husband ever touched her. Consider the scene as ancient physicians recorded it, young brides suffering spasms or fainting or lapsing into silence so deep it seemed like catatonia. Yet these symptoms were not recognized as trauma. They were interpreted as part of woman's nature, her weakness, her fragility, her supposed incapacity for reason. The violence of that first night was erased beneath layers of medical theory and poetic metaphor. The husband, meanwhile, saw himself as a general claiming victory. His peers would expect to hear the details the next day, proof that he had fulfilled his role. In some houses, tokens of blood-stained linens were displayed to confirm the bride's virginity, a grotesque trophy of her suffering. If she cried, if she shivered, if she lay in silence, it only enhanced his reputation. For the more frightened the bride, the greater his triumph appeared. The cruelty was magnified by the girl's youth. At an age when she might once have been playing games with her friends, she now endured a night of terror she could not escape. The torchlight, the chance, fading into the distance, the looming shadow of a husband decades older, all of it combined into a moment she would carry as scar tissue for the rest of her life. Rome remembered such nights not in whispers of compassion, but in metaphors of glory. What was for the bride a night of fear was for the empire another reenactment of its founding myth: conquest, victory, submission. Marriage was not a union, it was war, and the bride was the battlefield. Roman medicine, like Roman law, rarely paused to consider women's pain as anything but an inevitability. Physicians such as Serenus and Galen filled their treatises with observations on female health, yet their language revealed more about male expectations than women's realities. A bride's terror on her wedding night, her spasms or fainting her silence that stretched into days, these were not recognized as trauma but reinterpreted as natural expressions of the female body. Doctors called it hysteria, the womb wandering restlessly within the body, a disorder to be soothed, not understood. Medical texts describe young brides suffering from choking in the throat, trembling limbs, sudden muteness. Today we would recognize these as symptoms of psychological shock. The Romans, however, explained them as evidence of a body still unbroken and in need of correction. Marriage in this distorted view was the cure. The act of consummation would calm the wandering womb, settle the nerves, restore balance. Her terror became medical justification for the very violence that caused it. Some remedies bordered on cruelty disguised as care. Physicians prescribed wine or poppy-based draughts to dull a bride's resistance herbs that clouded the mind and relaxed the body. Midwives whispered advice about charms and amulets, superstitions meant to protect against infertility, but serving also to distract the girl from her dread. In wealthier households, ointments of myrrh and saffron were applied not for comfort, but to make the bride more acceptable to her husband's senses. None of it addressed her fear. It merely masked it the way perfume might disguise smoke in a burning room. But whispers from the margins tell a darker story. Ancient writers occasionally let slip what official texts ignored: the despair of women who would rather face death than their wedding beds. Stories circulate of brides who prayed to Dian, goddess of chastity, begging for escape. Others who sought to maim themselves to avoid consummation. Some drank too much of the very herbs meant to calm them, drifting into oblivion as a final act of resistance. Such accounts are rare, preserved only in fragments, for to write too openly about women's suffering was to risk scandal. Psychological terror echoed long after the wedding night ended. Some women developed patterns of silence so deep they were mistaken for piety. Others suffered recurring illnesses, fevers, miscarriages, mysterious pains that Roman doctors often dismissed as a weakness of the female constitution. Yet behind these diagnoses lay lives marked by chronic fear. To live as a Roman bride was to survive within a body that was never fully one's own, and still they endured. In private, some women shared herbs and whispered prayers, teaching younger brides how to dull the worst of their fear. Survival became an art of secrecy, coded gestures, discreet remedies, unspoken bonds between women who understood what could not be said aloud. Their strategies were fragile, their voices almost erased, but through them we glimpsed the hidden resilience that persisted even within Rome's machinery of control. In Rome, a queen's worth was measured not by her wisdom, her grace, or even her loyalty, but by her womb. The moment the wedding feast ended, pressure began. Her body was no longer private flesh, but public property, a vessel for dynastic survival. Every month that passed without a swelling belly invited whispers, accusations, and medical intrusions. Physicians and midwives probed her body as if she were livestock, delivering judgments on her fertility. If she conceived, that she was praised as a worthy matron. If she did not, she was treated as defective and embarrassment to her family and a danger to the state. The scrutiny was relentless. Roman law and custom regarded the production of male heirs as a wife's ultimate duty. Daughters, though tolerated, did not secure dynasties. A queen who bore only girls was often condemned as a failure, her value diminished with each unwanted birth. Some desperate to buy time faked pregnancies, padding their garments or claiming miscarriages to fend off dismissal. The humiliation of being weighed, examined, and monitored month after month turned many royal women into prisoners of their own biology. The political stakes were brutal. Julia, the daughter of Augustus, was married and divorced 3 times by the time she turned 25. Each union was designed to advance her father's ambitions, each dissolution a punishment for failing to produce the right heirs quickly enough. Her body was shuffled like a treaty between allies, a coin tossed from hand to hand. What Julia endured was not an exception but a pattern repeated across the empire. And then there was the horror of Nero and Poppaea Sabina. Poppaea, once celebrated for her beauty, became the emperor's wife and was expected to secure the dynasty with a son. When she conceived, all of Rome waited. But an argument, some say, about her pregnancy, others about her words, ended with Nero's boot striking her stomach. She died soon after her unborn child with her. The emperor's rage destroyed the very future he demanded of her. So, exposing the fatal paradox at the heart of Roman marriage, women were expected to create heirs, yet punished and killed under the same system that demanded them. This obsession with succession was not uniquely Roman. Dynasties across the ancient world treated fertility as the hinge upon which empires turned. In Egypt, queens were revered for bearing divine sons. In medieval Europe, the lack of a male heir could plunge kingdoms into civil war. But Rome made the obsession systemic. Its laws, rituals, and even its literature reinforced the idea that a woman's failure to bear sons was a personal crime. Her survival depended not on her character or her service, but on the fragile luck of chromosomes she could never control. For the empire, this fixation was rational male heirs secured the line of power. For the women who bore the burden, it was a life lived under the knife of constant expectation. Every birth was a test, every miscarriage a mark of disgrace, every daughter a disappointment. And yet even when they succeeded, they lived in fear, for a son could die young, leaving them once again worthless in the eyes of the dynasty. Thus Rome's grandeur, its emperors, its lineages, its continuity was built upon the backs of women pressed into service as breeding machines. Their triumphs were fleeting, their failures often fatal. Behind every marble bust of a young Caesar was a woman who had risked her life, endured humiliation, and carried the weight of empire in her womb. For Roman brides, survival did not end with the wedding night. It was only the beginning of a longer ordeal. Their bodies became battlefields broken by the relentless demands of dynasty. Pregnancy after pregnancy was expected, often beginning in adolescence before their frames were fully grown. Miscarriages were common and early deaths even more so. To give birth was to gamble with one's life, and many women lost. The statistics, as far as they can be reconstructed, are staggering. Historians estimate that in the Roman world, as many as 1 in 4 women might die in childbirth. Even those who survived often carried lasting injuries, ruptured bodies, infections, or damage that left them permanently weakened. Archaeologists examining skeletal remains of Roman women have found signs of repeated pelvic stress, widened hips, bone fractures, evidence of childbirth trauma endured again and again. These women were not exceptions. They were the silent foundation of the empire's continuity. Consider the fate of empresses and noblewomen whose lives are faintly recorded in chronicles. Many died before the age of 30, their names accompanied by notes of died in childbirth or taken by miscarriage. The annals rarely linger on the details, yet each brief mention hides years of pain, sleepless nights of fever, endless pregnancies, bodies hollowed by exhaustion. For them, the role of mother was not one of joy, but of duty, an unceasing test they could not refuse. The cruelty was systemic. If a queen miscarried, it was not treated as a tragedy, but as a failure, a flaw in her body's machinery. Her grief was rarely acknowledged, her pain considered irrelevant to the state's needs. Instead, she was urged to try again and again until her body gave out. Some were pregnant nearly every year of their short adult lives, each gestation a reminder that their survival mattered less than the survival of Rome's line. The archaeological record whispers of these costs. Graves of young women, some no older than 16, show evidence of childbirth, pelvic bones scarred by deliveries they did not survive. Inscriptions on tombstones speak of mothers snatched away in their youth, mourned for their beauty and obedience, but not for the suffering that ended them. Behind every emperor who inherited power stood a mother whose body had been broken in the process, her name fading into the margins of history. And the cruelty was compounded by the lack of medical care. Roman midwives knew techniques to ease labour, but there were no antiseptics, no safe surgeries for obstructed births. A difficult labour often ended in the death of both mother and child. Those who survived repeated pregnancies might face prolapse, chronic pain, or infertility, all conditions treated with suspicion or disdain as if the woman herself were to blame. The empire demanded heirs, but it exacted the price in flesh. Rome's marble statues, its arches of triumph, its lineages inscribed in stone. These monuments stood because women endured constant cycles of pregnancy, miscarriage, and loss. Their bodies bore the weight of continuity, and too often they were crushed beneath it. Behind the grandeur of dynasty was a trail of broken bodies, voices, silenced by the expectation that their suffering was necessary, even noble. But for the women themselves it was not noble. It was a lifetime of pain shortened by the unrelenting demands of empire. In Rome, silence was not only expected of women, it was exalted as their highest virtue. The cultural ideal of pudicitia, a word that blended chastity, modesty, and obedience, demanded not just sexual fidelity, but the suppression of voice itself. A virtuous woman was one who endured without complaint, who accepted humiliation without protest, who concealed her suffering so thoroughly that her silence became a badge of honour. This was not an abstract principle, but a lived reality enforced in daily life. A wife who spoke openly of her husband's violence dishonoured not only him, but her entire family. To admit abuse was to invite disgrace, as though the shame lay not in the cruelty, but in revealing it. A woman beaten until her body bore visible marks could not testify in court on her own behalf. The law dismissed her voice as invalid, requiring male witnesses to speak for her, and male witnesses bound by loyalty or self-interest rarely chose to do so. Roman epitaphs reveal how deeply this silence was embedded into memory itself. Tombstones of noble women praised them for being chaste, modest, and devoted to their household. The same phrases appear again and again. She stayed at home, she spun wool. Not a word about her joys, her fears, or her pain. Even in death, a woman's individuality was erased, replaced by formulaic praise for her obedience and silence. What today might read as tender remembrance was in truth the perpetuation of a cultural script that demanded women vanish into roles rather than live as people. The expectation was absolute. A Roman matron could be celebrated for 30 years of silent endurance, but condemned for a single act of resistance. Philosophers like Seneca wrote of women who accepted suffering with composure as paragons of virtue, comparing their silence to that of stoic heroes facing death. Yet the comparison was hollow. For men, silence was choice. For women, it was compulsion. This enforced silence created what might be called a cage of virtue. On the outside, it glittered with honour statues, inscriptions, the praise of poets. On the inside, it was suffocating a prison, where voices were smothered. A woman who remained silent in the face of violence was lauded. One who cried out was shamed. To endure was noble, to speak was disgraceful. The cruelty of pudicitia lay in how it turned suffering into proof of worth. A wife who bore her husband's blows without complaint, who hid her miscarriages with composure, who smiled while being traded in dynastic bargains, she was celebrated as the ideal Roman matron. The system did not merely ignore women's pain, it weaponized their silence, transforming endurance into a form of civic duty. And so generation after generation women disappeared behind the mask of pudicitia. Their epitaphs told us nothing of their fears. Their tombs held no words of protest. Rome glorified their silence, and in doing so ensured that their suffering was both invisible and eternal. In a world where women's voices were forbidden, survival depended on subtler languages. Roman matrons and brides learned to weave warnings into the fabric of daily life, gestures, clothing choices, ornaments that spoke in whispers where speech could not. These codes of warning were invisible to the men who dismissed women's presence as ornamental, but among women themselves they carried life-saving meaning. Jewellery, for instance, was more than decoration. A brooch fastened at an unusual angle, A necklace worn on the wrong day or the deliberate absence of a ring could signal danger. A wife suffering from abuse might adjust her garments to reveal a bruise accidentally to sympathetic female relatives who would recognize the mark for what it was. Patterns of embroidery carried hidden messages. A vine stitched into a hem could symbolize entanglement or captivity. A bird fleeting freedom never achieved. Gestures became a private lexicon. A hand lingering too long on a necklace, a downward glance when a husband's name was spoken, a sudden stillness in the presence of certain men. These were cues deciphered by other women who knew how to look. At festivals where women mingled more freely, such codes spread quietly, creating networks of awareness invisible to male observers. Anthropologists have identified similar systems in other oppressive societies. Enslaved peoples in the Americas used songs and quilts to encode escape routes. Prisoners developed tapping codes on cell walls. Even in Victorian England, flowers carried meanings in the language of florography, a way for women to express forbidden feelings under rigid moral scrutiny. Rome's matrons too built their own underground language, one born not of luxury but of necessity. This system of resistance was fragile but powerful. It created solidarity in a culture determined to isolate them. A young bride might learn through a whispered hint or a subtle gesture which men were dangerous, which households harbored cruelty, which physicians could be trusted to keep secrets. These warnings could not change the system, but they could help women navigate its dangers, sparing them from its worst traps. Yet the brilliance of these codes lay also in their invisibility. To Roman men, women's clothing and jewelry were simply tokens of vanity, evidence of their supposed frivolity. In truth, these adornments were often armor, carrying hidden meanings that shielded women in a world that denied them voice. What seemed to be silence was in fact speech transformed into another medium. Through these subtle systems, Roman women proved that even within cages, the human spirit seeks ways to communicate, to resist, to protect one another. Their codes were not loud enough to topple the empire's patriarchy, but they were loud enough to echo across centuries as proof of women's ingenuity in the face of silence. In a world where women's voices were forbidden, survival depended on subtler languages. Roman matrons and brides learned to weave warnings into the fabric of daily life gestures, clothing choices, ornaments that spoke in whispers where speech could not. These codes of warning were invisible to the men who dismissed women's presence as ornamental, but among women themselves they carried life-saving meaning. Jewelry, for instance, was more than decoration. A brooch fastened at an unusual angle, a necklace worn on the wrong day, or the deliberate absence of a ring could signal danger. A wife suffering from abuse might adjust her garments to reveal a bruise accidentally to sympathetic female relatives who would recognize the mark for what it was. Patterns of embroidery carried hidden messages. A vine stitched into a hem could symbolize entanglement or captivity. A bird fleeting freedom never achieved. Gestures became a private lexicon. A hand lingering too long on a necklace, a downward glance when a husband's name was spoken, a sudden stillness in the presence of certain men. These were cues deciphered by other women who knew how to look. At festivals where women mingled more freely, such codes spread quietly, creating networks of awareness invisible to male observers. Anthropologists have identified similar systems in other oppressive societies. Enslaved peoples in the Americas used songs and quilts to encode escape routes. Prisoners developed tapping codes on cell walls. Even in Victorian England, flowers carried meanings in the language of florography, a way for women to express forbidden feelings under rigid moral scrutiny. Rome's matrons too built their own underground language, one born not of luxury but of necessity. This system of resistance was fragile but powerful. It created solidarity in a culture determined to isolate them. A young bride might learn through a whispered hint or a subtle gesture which men were dangerous, which households harbored cruelty, which physicians could be trusted to keep secrets. These warnings could not change the system, but they could help women navigate its dangers, sparing them from its worst traps. Yet the brilliance of these codes lay also in their invisibility. To Roman men, women's clothing and jewelry were simply tokens of vanity, evidence of their supposed frivolity. In truth, these adornments were often armor, carrying hidden meanings that shielded women in a world that denied them voice. What seemed to be silence was in fact speech transformed into another medium. Through these subtle systems, Roman women proved that even within cages, the human spirit seeks ways to communicate, to resist, to protect one another. Their codes were not loud enough to topple the empire's patriarchy, but they were loud enough to echo across centuries as proof of women's ingenuity in the face of silence. In Rome, a woman's reputation was more fragile than glass and more dangerous than steel. It could shatter in an instant, and when it did, it often destroyed her life. A whisper, a rumour, a carefully planted accusation was enough to topple even the most powerful empress. For women who lived in palaces, the walls themselves seemed to breathe with gossip, carrying tales that could become death sentences. Julia, the daughter of Augustus, learned this lesson with devastating clarity. Married and remarried as her father's political ambitions required, she was eventually accused of adultery, a charge historians now believe was exaggerated or fabricated. The punishment was merciless. Augustus the emperor, who preached morality, exiled his own daughter to a barren island. There she lived in isolation, stripped of luxury, forbidden to drink wine, forbidden even to receive visitors without approval. Once praised as the jewel of Rome, Julia died forgotten, her name reduced to a cautionary tale. Her alleged sin mattered less than her father's need to preserve his moral image. Her reputation, not her deeds, determined her fate. Even women who managed to remain in their husband's favour lived under constant threat of slander. Livia, wife of Augustus and Empress for more than 50 years, navigated decades of whispers that she manipulated her husband, poisoned rivals, and schemed to place her son on the throne. Historians today debate how much of this was fact and how much was invention, but in her own time the effect was the same. Her reputation was a battlefield. Every rumour forced her to manoeuvre carefully, building networks of loyalty, employing spies to monitor talk, and rewarding those who silenced dangerous chatter. The machinery of rumour in Rome was vast. Slaves carried tales overheard in corridors, senators spread insinuations to weaken rivals, poets cloaked gossip in satire. Information travelled quickly in the markets and forums where scandal was currency, as valuable as coin. For men, rumours could wound careers. For women, they could annihilate existence. A husband had only to claim suspicion of adultery or impropriety, and the law and society would side with him. In many ways, this was political assassination by words. Just as daggers in the forum ended the lives of Caesar or Caligula's enemies, whispers in the atrium ended the lives of women who had no defence. To Rome, appearances mattered more than truth. A woman did not need to commit a crime to be destroyed. She needed only to be imagined as having done so. The phenomenon has echoes in every age. Modern smear campaigns, political scandals, or online shaming follow the same pattern. Reputation becomes weapon, rumour becomes reality. The speed of communication has changed, but the principle remains chillingly familiar. Silence cannot protect those whose lives are decided by what others choose to believe. For Roman women, there was no safe harbour. Their beauty could be turned into evidence of seduction, their intelligence into proof of scheming, their ambition into cause for exile or death. Reputation was not a reflection of who they were, but a tool wielded by others. And in an empire where men wrote the histories, their stories were buried beneath layers of rumour, leaving us to wonder how many lives were destroyed not by crimes committed, but by words whispered. Rome endures in memory as a marvel of civilization, its aqueducts, roads, palaces, and laws shaping the very idea of empire. Yet beneath the grandeur of marble colonnades and triumphal arches lay a darker foundation, one built not only on conquest abroad, but on domination at home. The queens and the brides of Rome were not partners in this glory, they were victims of it. Their lives were bartered as contracts, their bodies pressed into service for dynasties, their voices smothered in the name of pudicitia. What history often celebrates as ceremony was for them a theatre of terror. They lived in a system that demanded silence and rewarded suffering. Dressed as sacrifices, carried like cargo, examined like breeding stock, and disciplined like soldiers under command, Roman women endured a cruelty that was ritualized and sanctified. Even in death, their epitaphs erased their individuality, reducing them to formulae of obedience and virtue. The empire immortalized their silence in stone, ensuring that their pain was hidden beneath the very monuments that still draw our awe today. But history whispers if we listen closely. Behind every law codified by jurists, behind every poem that romanticized conquest, behind every statue of emperors and heirs stood women whose lives were broken in service of power. Their absence from the record is not proof of insignificance, it is proof of erasure. And in that silence lies the most damning testimony of all. Rome's story is not unique. Every empire in its own way has used spectacle to mask cruelty, demanding sacrifice from the voiceless while celebrating the triumphs of the powerful. Palaces gleam while prisons are hidden, victories are carved in marble while suffering is written only on flesh. The lesson is timeless. Whenever we marvel at grandeur, we must ask whose pain lies beneath it, whose sense makes the spectacle possible. To remember these women is to pierce the mask Rome so carefully crafted. It is to honour the brides who cried as they were dragged from their mothers, the wives beaten for speaking the mothers who died in childbirth while emperors demanded heirs. It is to restore dignity where history denied it, to speak the words they were forbidden to say. Rome's beauty remains, but its greatness must always be measured against the cost it extracted in human lives. The fragility of dignity, the ease with which power can strip it away, is not a relic of the past, but a warning for the present. For every age is tempted to hide cruelty behind spectacle, to confuse silence with order, to call suffering the price of progress. The marble mask still stands. Our duty is to remember what it conceals. The mask of glory. The human cost beneath. The story of Rome's brides and queens is not simply an account of ancient customs, it is a mirror held up to power itself. Rome dazzled the world with its laws, its architecture, and its armies. But behind the marble, women were treated as property sacrifices wrapped in veils, their voices distanced by law and custom. The grandeur we admire was built in part on their suffering. This history unsettles because it reveals how easily cruelty can be disguised as tradition, how pain can be dressed up as ceremony. Roman weddings were celebrated as joyous occasions, yet they were rituals of submission. The legal codes claimed to preserve order, yet they sanctioned domination. Even the myths of Rome, the Sabine women Lucretia, were retold in ways that glorified endurance and erased despair. The mask of empire was polished so brightly that for centuries it blinded us to what lay underneath. What lessons then can we take from this? The first is to recognize that silence is not always consent. Roman brides were required to cry and resist, but once the ceremony ended, their ongoing suffering was hidden by enforced silence. How often even today do we mistake quiet endurance for acceptance? In families, workplaces, or societies, we must be careful not to confuse silence with agreement or tradition with justice. The second lesson is that power thrives on spectacle. Rome used public ritual to make cruelty appear natural, even sacred. The empire's strength rested not only on armies, but on its ability to normalize oppression through ritual and repetition. We see echoes of this whenever institutions use ceremony law or polished images to conceal the suffering of those who serve them. To be wise is to look beyond appearances and ask what and who has been sacrificed to maintain them. The third lesson is the danger of measuring human worth by utility. Roman women were valued for producing heirs, nothing more. Their health, individuality, and dignity were expendable. Though our world has changed, we still risk falling into similar patterns when we reduce people to their roles, when we see them only as workers, providers, or symbols rather than as full human beings. True dignity comes when people are valued not for what they produce, but for who they are. Finally, Rome reminds us that every empire leaves behind both monuments and silences. The stones endure, the stories of power remain, but the voices of the vulnerable are often lost. Our responsibility as inheritors of history is to recover those silences, to listen for what was deliberately erased. By remembering the women Rome tried to bury beneath ritual and marble, we reclaim not only their dignity, but also a measure of our own humanity. Rome's mask of glory still gleams. But the lesson of its brides is clear whenever beauty is used to conceal cruelty. Whenever silence is mistaken for order, we must look harder, listen closer, and dare to speak for those who could not. Only then can we ensure that dignity, not domination, becomes the true foundation of our lives. Thank you so much for keeping me company tonight. Don't forget to subscribe so we can share many more stories together.